While I was working on the last video essay, I was thinking about more musicians that made music through loss. As I said in the last video, Rush had gone through a mourning period, and it affected their music. Vapor Trails was a very sad, very angry, mournful album that had its heart on its sleeves, and it was all the better for it. It was a very beautiful album throughout it all. They didn't go through the usual route and made everything really angry. It was the heaviest Rush album in their catalog, but all the emotions came through. For every beautiful, mournful album like Vapor Trails, there is an album that is the complete opposite. An album that is heavy in a literal sense. And for that, we shall go to the world of thrash. By 1986, Metallica had come off of 3 albums with escalating success. Their musicianship had gotten better by each album. They went from young adults that bled their influences, ranging from Diamond Head, Iron Maiden, and Motorhead, to being an entirely different band on their own. By the time Master of Puppets came out, the band was firing on all cylinders, to the point where they were touring with Ozzy Osbourne. But despite the professional highs, they were hit by a heavy loss with the death of bassist Cliff Burton after their tour bus crashed on September 27, 1986, leaving a big hole in their musicianship. With Rush, when the band lost someone, it wasn't a band member, it was a loved one. In fact, it was 2 loved ones, and it happened to one person when the band hit middle age. How they dealt with it was by taking some time off, wondering how the future was going to be, and what would happen if they got back together. Metallica, however, were in their 20s, and they had lost a vital member of their band, while they, arguably, were at their thrash metal peak. According to Kirk Hammett, they had a hard time with this loss because they didn't actually experience a mourning period up to that point. They didn't know how to deal with what happened. They just knew that they had to breathe a little bit, mourn for their fallen friend, and find a replacement so they could keep making music. Note the words "a little bit." In terms of mourning, a person or people need to take time to stop and catch themselves, and wonder how to move forward. This is what Rush did since they were mature men during these tragic events. However, Metallica went ahead with touring commitments, recruiting Flotsam and Jetsam bassist Jason Newsted as a new member, and eventually recording an album. That album, and Justice for All. The album marked yet another change in their musicianship. With their first 3 albums, they were a thrash metal, but you can tell that there was a growth with each album. Between Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning, they demonstrated that they had musical approaches that showcased heaviness, not only being fast-tempo songs and being one-dimensional, and they showcased that growth again with Master of Puppets, by growing their thrash metal sound and displaying bigger atmosphere and grander scopes in their lyrics, showing that they can explore the core sound while going in a further direction. However, with And Justice for All, it was a lot more progressive and a lot more angrier. In fact, this was their most aggressive album up to that point. Thrash metal as a whole always had an aggressive edge, which makes sense considering that it is a darker and edgier descendant of speed metal, and it usually dealt with topics like war, injustice, murder, and isolation, amongst many subjects, and Metallica had more than their fair share of presenting these topics in their musical form. However, these subjects became heavier due to the more aggressive and multi-layered instrumentation. They pushed forward with what was presented on Master of Puppets, and grew. There was an emphasis on fast tempos with this progressive edge, leading to less melodies compared to their other albums. The motivation for the band, sonic-wise, was to have the listener feel like that they were being punched in the face. They wanted the instrumentation to go full force, and the vocals from James have changed as well. It has been said that the loss of Cliff had been the cause of it. Listening to a song like the title track and listening to a song like Battery, the vocals are a lot more harsher on the former. Metallica were no strangers to talking about death in their songs. Songs like Fade to Black talk about someone who is in such despair that they will commit suicide. Ride the Lightning's about execution by the electric chair, and Creeping Death talks about the plague that was inflicted by the Egyptians. According to James, people went up to the band and said, "Now that Cliff is dead, I guess you can't talk about death in your songs anymore." in which they replied, "What? Now there's even more reason to write about it." And since the band were still going through their mourning period, they delved right into that. The album delved into topical subjects like the previous album, but it was a lot more internal, making it one of their more personal albums. They were in a moment of transition, a dark place. And what did they do with those dark moments? They wrote them out. And it is exemplified in the song Dyer's Eve, a song that is about James's parents and the frustrations and anxieties he had as a result of being raised in a religious household. Harvester of Sorrow is about a man whose sanity slips and then he takes it on his family before losing it completely and murdering them. The Frayed Ends of Sanity is about the increasing inability to tell the difference between fantasy and reality. One, arguably their breakthrough single, talks about a soldier whose arms and legs are destroyed by a landmine, unable to see or move, yet is still conscious and begging for death, away from his mental prison. And To Live Is to Die is a mostly instrumental tribute to their fallen bandmate. The album delves deep into the broader topics that weren't really explored on their previous albums. Anger is no stranger to the world of thrash, but on this album, it's on full force. And it is night and day when one hears darker albums like this and then Vapor Trails. Vapor Trails seemed like they were going through grief with music, more like a healing process. With And Justice for All, it seemed like they were working their grief by taking it out on music. However, unlike Rush, they not only took their grief out in song, but Metallica took their grief out on their new bandmate. It has been said that the lack of bass on the album was part of hazing the new person in their group at the instruction of James and Lars. However, they said that the ears had been shot after years of heavy touring and turned the other instruments up so that you couldn't hear the bass. Newsted had been quite vocal about the final result, as has mixer Steve Thompson, who wanted to quit due to Lars' bass removal, but executive meddling disallowed this. And the producer of the album, Flemming Rasmussen, said that despite looking over the album, he did not know why they wanted the bass to be the way it was, but there was nothing that he could do. Prior to him joining, Jason was a fan of the band and he was saddened by Cliff's death, and joining the band made him a promoted fanboy. James has said that they wanted to beat the fan out of him since Newsted was quote-unquote goofy enough to take it, and this lasted 14 years. Cliff was considered the lead bassist of the band before his death. He convinced the band to move from LA, which was the metal hotspot of the 80s, like Seattle was to grunge in the 90s, to San Francisco, which helped them in the end. He had a stage presence that he made into his own, and he was considered amazingly talented even when he was alive. So when Jason came to replace him, they just saw him as a fan, not a member in the sense that the others were. It wasn't until later that Jason was considered a fantastic bassist in his own right, with some even flat out saying that he was better than Cliff. It seemed that Jason was respected everywhere else in the music world except in Metallica. I see the lack of bass on this album as a response to their ongoing grief. Though the band probably didn't mean to do this, if you look at the lack of bass simply due to the fact that Jason simply wasn't Cliff, it makes some sense. Acting out in terms of grief is not uncommon, especially when it comes to meeting different people while in the mourning period. It reminded me of the episode of South Park, where the main characters were looking for someone to replace their then permanently dead Kenny. They have the other kids go through some tryouts, pick one friend after a while, and proceed to guilt the new member as a new member, not a person, but someone to fill in their group. Whenever the new member would say something that would go against the group's plans, the boys would be passive-aggressive, saying how much they miss Kenny, and how Kenny would be on board with the plot, causing the new person to take back what they said and be on board. Eventually, Kenny comes back at the end of the season. Metallica would never get Cliff back, resulting in their grief in their musicianship in their album, and to their newest bandmate. All this results in a heavy album in more ways than one. An interesting result of what happens when one tries to go forward without taking things in, shutting people out either consciously or not. It's not healthy, but it's understandable. These albums show that there are different ways of dealing with grief in music, and music is always relatable. What did you think of this video? Leave a comment to tell me what you thought. If you like this video, click the like button so this can go around to people. Subscribe if you want to be in the loop about this channel, and I will see you in the next video.